data that we will be going over today. And with that, if you have any questions or problems, just type them in and we will address. If you can't hear, if you can't see, we have technicians that are monitoring this webinar, and we will address your needs as we're able to. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Laura McKelvey to introduce our first speaker.
Hi, this is Laura again, and I'm sure we don't need to introduce Mike to you again, but I will just to make sure there's no new people on the line. Mike's our Deputy Office Director of the Office of Air Quality Planning and Standards here in Research Triangle Park, and our office is responsible for this monitoring. And so, Mike, I'll turn it over to you, and you can start going through the data.
Thank you very much, both Laura and Holly, for setting the stage today. So earlier today, we did post 8 additional sampling days. That brings the total of available sampling days to 31 over about a 13-week period. That, of course, is more information than we've discussed with you previously. I'll note that as we are collecting this data, we are working towards a risk assessment that we'll have available in the spring time frame. We believe the data we've collected to date help in that regard. It is still premature looking at this limited data set to draw conclusions about the long-term health risks, but that in fact is what our risk assessment is intended to do, to help us better understand exposure and long-term health risks in this community. Our plan is to continue monitoring. We've said all along that we will be monitoring for 3 months to collect a sufficient database to inform the risk assessment. But given other developments in the community, we have continued to monitor, and we can talk more about that as we get into the webinar. This slide shows the monitoring locations. We have 8 monitoring locations, the various stars, dots, and diamonds. And I think most of you are familiar with these locations. The 2 purple boxes with X's are the location of the 2 sterilization buildings. I'll just note that during the first week in February, side-by-side measurements began to be collected by the village and the company. We do not have that information to report today. We have ongoing conversations to address data comparability, but we will not be speaking to any of those side-by-side measurements today. We will only be talking about the EPA measurements collected at these 8 locations. The calendar of sampling, again, our commitment was to sample for 3 months. That takes us through about the end of February. And those samples have been collected, but as I mentioned earlier, we have continued to sample in light of the seal order on the facility in order for us to better understand what concentrations are in the area following the shutdown of the facility. So let's walk through the data. Here we are looking at a 13-week average of concentrations from the EPA monitoring sites. Nothing special about a 13-week average other than it is the full data set that we have to date. And as we look at these data, as we look at this slide in particular, we see 3 features that are consistent with our prior conversations. First, we see the highest concentrations at the 2 close-in sites, the Village Hall and the warehouse. We continue to believe that the facility is responsible for a significant amount of ethylene oxide in the area, as indicated by the highest levels at these 2 close-in sites. A second feature is that the concentrations drop fairly quickly as you move away from the 2 sterilization buildings. But as we will see on some days, one of the downwind sites, the water tower site in particular, is actually recording the highest sites on specific days, and we have 3 examples of that in the data set we'll talk about today. A third feature is that at the community sites, we are generally measuring lower concentrations, but we are actually measuring concentrations there. So low yet measurable concentrations at the community-oriented sites. The averages on this particular slide reflects some days when those community sites are downwind, reflecting the influence from the facility. But there are many other days where they are not downwind, when they are upwind. And the fact that we are getting low yet measurable concentration suggests to us that there are other sources of ethylene oxide in the area. And as we've talked in the past, that is an ongoing investigation we have. We're continuing to look at our emissions inventories. We're continuing to analyze these monitoring data and other monitoring data collected around the country to better understand potential other sources. So we have a process, but we do not have answers to what those other sources might be. So we have 8 days to walk through today, starting with January 22nd. This was a Tuesday, and as you can see from the windrows in the upper right-hand corner, winds were strongly out of the south. I'll just back up a reminder about how to read the windrows. The spokes indicate the direction from which the wind is blowing. So as you can see here, there are many hours where the winds are out of the south, but you can also see that there are some hours where winds are out of other directions. But winds on this particular day were primarily out of the south. And the colors reflect the wind speed. The hotter colors reflect higher speeds. So again, this is a Tuesday, strong winds out of the south, suggesting transport to the north. And this is one of those days where the highest monitoring location was not one of the two close-in sites, but in fact was a downwind site, the water tower about half a mile to the north. The reading there was almost 11 micrograms. And then farther to the north, Willow Pond, the concentrations drop off, suggesting a gradient that concentrations are falling with downwind distance. But on this particular day, given the strong transport pattern, it was the downwind site to the north that had the highest reading, not one of the two close-in sites. We'll see this again when we look at February 1st and February 2nd, but we've also seen this type of pattern back in December on one of the sampling days and even back in November. So when we have winds, strong winds out of the south, we do tend to see the highest impact being at the water tower site, not one of the two close-in sites. January 24th, Thursday, strong winds out of the west. This is a lower concentration day. We do not have monitoring locations directly east of the facilities, so we don't know what those concentrations are downwind, but all of the sites in the network, as you can see, are recording concentrations on the order of 0.2 micrograms or lower. January 27th, a Sunday, the winds were quite changeable on this particular day. We have some hours where the winds were out of the west, some hours where they're out of the south, southwest, and a fair number of hours where they were out of the east, northeast. I mean, the east, southeast, I should say. The highest concentration was measured at the Village Hall, 19 micrograms. And then farther downwind, moving to the northwest, Hinsdale South High School was a little more than 3 micrograms. I'll just note that on this particular day, these are the highest values that we've recorded at those sites, at the Village Hall and the high school site in the 30-plus days of sampling. February 1st, very similar to January 22nd, and as you'll see in a minute, very similar to February 2nd. Strong winds out of the south. again, suggesting transport to the north. And again, this is another day where the highest value is actually occurring downwind at the water tower, not one of the two close-in sites. As you can see, the reading at the water tower was a little more than 9 micrograms, pretty close to the reading back on January 22nd. February 2nd, winds look pretty similar to the day before. Again, mostly out of the south or south-southwest. Once again, suggesting transport to the north. And in fact, we do see the highest value at the water tower site, a little more than 7 micrograms. February 5th, a Tuesday. We have winds coming out of the east, northeast for many hours, but significantly we have winds from a number of different directions throughout the day, throughout the 24-hour period. On this particular day, the highest levels are at the warehouse site, a little more than 26 micrograms, the highest reading we've seen at that particular location. The Village Hall site was also quite high. We had co-located measurements at that location on this day, 17 and 15 micrograms at that location. Downwind on this day could be the West Neighborhood site at 5 micrograms, falling off to a little more than 1 microgram at Gower Elementary for the hours when the winds had more of an easterly component. But worth noting is that Gower Middle is also somewhat high at 3 micrograms, which could reflect the hours where the winds were more out of the northwest. February 8th, a Friday, strong winds out of the west, suggesting transport to the east. We were seeing high concentrations at the warehouse site. You can see the two co-located values of 5 and 4.3 micrograms. All the other readings are relatively low, on the order of 0.2 to 0.4 micrograms. And the final day we have to present today is February 11th. Strong northeasterly winds, suggesting transport towards the west. There are some impacts at the Village Hall site. You see the two co-located readings, a little less than 4 and a little more than 4 micrograms. And as you move to the west, concentrations falling off to a little more than 1 microgram at the neighborhood site and about 0.4 by the time you reach Gower Elementary. So those are the 8 days that we have to present today. Again, the data are online. We'll make the slides available, and we'll open up for questions.
Yeah, so we're going to start off with the questions, and so the first one we've gotten is people have heard the term actionable limit. What does that mean, and does EPA have actionable limits for ethylene oxide?
Okay, this is Mike Kerber. I'll take this question. I'll note I have a couple other technical experts in the room to help me with the really hard questions. I'll just note that we do not have a bright line or a level for ethylene oxide below which air quality is considered okay. Ethylene oxide is one of almost 190 pollutants under the Clean Air Act that are classified as hazardous air pollutants, also called air toxics. And under the Clean Air Act, we regulate air toxics by setting limits on the amount of pollution that facilities can emit to the air, not by setting ambient standards. We do set ambient standards for certain pollutants like ozone and particles, but for air toxics, we do not set safe levels. And because there is not a bright line, that's why we do risk assessments, to characterize the risk and to try to reduce risk to the community.
Okay, so the next question is, all the testing's been in the winter. Would you generally expect that the readings in the summer would be higher or lower than in the winter?
This is Mike again, and I'll turn to Lou to see if he has thoughts. But I think as we've noted in the past, we don't have a lot of experience measuring for this chemical. We have limited information here. We started up our sampling, as you all know, in mid-November. We don't have information before then. I know there was a day or two back in May, but that does not give us really a good seasonal profile. Lou?
Yeah, Mike, I certainly agree with that response. It's a good question. My only sense would be meteorology might be different in the summer. Winds could be lower. The dispersion patterns as well as the wind roses that are seasonally in the area could be different. But that's a question that right now we don't have the information to answer.
Thanks, Lou. How would Willowbrook's results, or have Willowbrook's results been compared to EPA's? And if so, how can the disparity between the data be explained?
This is Mike again. I mentioned earlier that there were side-by-side measurements collected by the village and the company starting in the first week in February. We've seen a day or two of those measurements. We started to have conversations at the technical level to discuss data comparability, where there are similarities, where there are differences. We have so little side-by-side measurements that we've not been able to draw any conclusions about data comparability, but we'll want to continue to look at additional days and want to continue to have technical discussions so we can come to that point where we will be able to address data comparability. We just don't have enough information to do that yet.
Okay, is the EPA conducting air monitoring testing? Oh, sorry. I tripped as I was trying to read this. Is the EPA conducting air monitoring testing at all ETO emitting facilities in our nation? If not, why not?
This is Mike. No, we are not doing that. Under our regulatory program for air toxics, we do risk assessments, and those are primarily based on dispersion modeling. The National Air Toxics Assessment that we conducted and released last year, which first identified this chemical as being a concern in a number of communities, was based on dispersion modeling. So our process going forward has been to try to gather better information, improve upon those risk assessments to better characterize the risk in communities throughout the country. And under our hybrid strategy, there is a prong where we are doing case-by-case review to gather information, conduct more refined modeling to get a better handle on what the risks are.
So you keep saying that you're investigating these other sources. What are you doing to investigate the other sources?
So there are two things. One is looking at emissions inventories, and the other is looking at air monitoring data. With respect to emission inventories, it's a matter of looking at the data we have in front of us, what's in our national emissions inventory, as well as what might be in the toxics release inventory, or TRI. It's a matter of mining that information to look for gaps, to see if there are sources we're missing, are emission factors and emission estimates reasonable. So that is active work that we are doing. In addition, monitoring data. These data in particular are really helpful in terms of identifying potential other sources that might not be in our emissions inventories. So it's a matter of mining the ambient data, especially for days when a particular site is upwind of the sterilization buildings, as well as looking at monitoring data for other parts of the country. So those are all pieces we're still trying to put together. We haven't come up with any answers yet.
And the next question, there's no monitoring locations to the east. Shouldn't there have been any there?
Yeah, and this is Lou Weinstock, and we understand that observation and comment. You know, as we've mentioned previously, it wasn't the intent of the program itself to measure in every possible location. You know, Monday morning quarterbacking as it is, I think, yes, it would have been good to have a site or two to the east. We're confident that what we're seeing to the south, to the north, and to the west indicates the dispersion based on the different wind directions. If we would have had something to the east, I think we feel confident we would see the same levels in that direction. But yes, knowing what we know now, I think, yes, it would have been appropriate to have a site to the east of the facility.
So, and the next question is there any way to determine how much EPO is being released to correspond to the ambient monitoring results?
This is Mike again. Clearly, we see in the monitoring data significant day-to-day variations. Meteorology is a factor there, but operations at the facility are also a factor. So looking at that day-to-day variation will help us to better understand the pattern of ethylene oxide emissions from this facility. In addition, we can use our air dispersion models and compare those concentration estimates to what we think the emissions are to better characterize emissions. So it's a matter of analyzing these data, monitoring data, as well as applying our dispersion models that'll help us to understand what the actual emissions are on the sampling days.
Are there more days of testing scheduled for Willowbrook, and when will the testing stop?
Our plan, as I said earlier, had been to collect 3 months of data, which would have taken us through the end of February, but we are continuing to monitor at this time. In particular, we are interested in seeing how concentrations have changed since the state seal order was issued on February 15th. And our plan is to make decisions about future monitoring after we receive and analyze data from that post-seal order period.
Okay. And the next question is there, oops. Okay, if there isn't a safe line, what parameters are used to ensure public safety for hazardous air pollutants? Is this just a monitoring program, or are there enforcement tools available?
So our goal has been all along to do a more refined risk assessment. The National Air Toxics Assessment that we were starting from is a national assessment. It doesn't give us the refined information within each and every community. So that is what we have been working towards for some months now, is to better characterize what risks are, to see if there are steps that can be taken as quickly as possible to reduce emissions and reduce risk. But it's a matter of characterizing those risks and having that as the basis for making informed decisions going forward.
And that those informed decisions may be regulatory?
I think we've said all along that under our hybrid strategy that there are regulatory actions already in play, but in addition, on a case-by-case basis, taking other actions more immediate are certainly something that we are interested in pursuing.
Okay, on the day where it's high at the water tower, despite the wind direction, is it possible there's a building or natural wind barrier that's preventing ETO from being swept away, allowing it to accumulate?
This is Lou Weinstock. The days where we've seen the elevated concentrations at the water tower, and again, just I'll repeat for confirmation, December 19th, January 22nd, February 1st and 2nd, the wind is straight out of the south, pointing at the water tower. There really aren't any other days that we've seen elevated compared to background where the water tower has been high. So I think in our judgment so far, virtually everything we're seeing at the sites can be explained by the wind direction.
Okay. The next question is, how does the seal order affect what you're doing?
Well, specifically related to the monitoring, it has caused us to continue monitoring. We want to better understand how that has affected ethylene oxide levels in the community. So we're going to continue monitoring beyond the end of February. We're going to make decisions about future monitoring after we receive and analyze some of that information. And we should have that information ready for our next webinar in another couple weeks.
Okay. Okay, why are the native risks so much lower than the risks as calculated based on the sample concentrations? The disparity seems rather large.
So we need to keep in mind that when we do risk assessments and the analysis we did for NADA, the National Air Toxics Assessment, was dispersion modeling reflecting levels over a 70-year lifetime. That's not directly comparable to an individual 24-hour sample like we're looking at here. So the time average differences are pretty significant and need to be kept in mind when you try to compare one number against another.
Okay, what's the sensitivity of the testing procedure? What are the chances that the results of non-detect ethylene oxide was still the question moves. What are the chances the results can be that non-detect ethylene oxide is still present?
This is Lou Weinstock. Our detectable limit for ethylene oxide, which we mentioned before, is 0.082 micrograms per cubic meter. We have worked very, very closely with our laboratory, particularly over the last couple of months, to get their detection and their care in looking at the individual chromatograms which come out of the instrument that analyzes for ethylene oxide. They look as carefully as possible. We're very, very confident that in any sample, if there's a detectable amount of ethylene oxide, we're going to be able to see it and to quantify it. You may remember in a previous data posting, we had mentioned that there were some non-detects in our first posting that actually became low concentrations. That was due in part to that effort of working with our laboratory. So going forward, and particularly in this data posting, if you actually see an ND, and there are very few of them, we are highly confident that, in fact, there is nothing measurable in terms of ethylene oxide in that particular sample.
Okay, Styrogenics stopped reporting to the TRI. How can you use this information, this to inform other sources?
So the Toxics Release Inventory Program has certain requirements for companies to report data. It's our understanding that in prior years, facilities owned by Styrogenics, including the Willowbrook facility, categorized themselves in a sector that would not trigger TRI reporting requirements, but nonetheless, they were submitting their data to TRI. It's also our understanding that Styrogenics facilities did not submit data to TRI in 2017. And I'll note that each year we review changes in reporting, and we're reviewing this particular change in reporting, but don't have an official position on that today.
Okay, are you ready?
Yeah.
Concerning the upwind and downwind concentration disparity, if the source of emissions stack opposes to fugitive, to me that suggests that the ground level SEMA canisters may not be collecting ETO because it's been whisked away at the stack height and being swept by the wind before it can settle to the ground.
So we are certainly seeing, as I said before, significant day-to-day variation. Meteorology is definitely a factor there, but also operations at the facility, and we need to try to understand all of that to better understand the concentrations that we're measuring here.
Okay. I hope that the post seal order calculation, I'm probably going to need to get closer to the phone. I hope that the post seal order calculations take into account off-gassing, which will continue to occur for 256 hours after the final process was completed by Styrogenics.
So I don't know if you have the sampling schedule in front of you. I have it in front of me. So the seal order went in place on the 15th. Our next sampling day was the 19th, and then we had a sampling day on the 20th. We continued to collect data after that. The next day that all 8 sites were operating was the 23rd, and then sampling again on the 26th of February. So we have continued to collect data for a number of days beyond the seal order going into effect. And monitoring, as I indicated earlier, is continuing into the month of March.
Okay, and the next question is, will you be comparing the ambient monitoring results against the company's daily usage logs?
We'll be considering all of this information when we do our risk assessment. Certainly better characterizing emissions using any information we get from the company as well as information that we are collecting ourselves is going to be helpful for our work.
Okay, and then the next question is, how are micro wind patterns being taken into account?
This is Lou Weinstock. We have meteorological measurements as close as possible to the maximum concentration sites right by on the Willowbrook EPA warehouse. Now, it's certainly true that even with a close-in weather station, there may be situations where the wind flow around the buildings affects the concentrations that we read. But in general, between the data we have from our Met Tower, the comparisons we've done with the Argonne National Lab, and also Midway Airport, we feel like what we have is representative of what the network is seeing. But yes, it's certainly possible under overnight light wind conditions that some of the concentrations that we're seeing, particularly at the close-in sites, may not always be explainable even by the meteorology on the warehouse.
Okay, so before I ask the next question, one of the things that recurring theme in today's questions are TRI questions. And so we're going to reach out to the folks that do the TRI and make sure that they have a chance to respond to your questions directly. So we're going to capture these and make sure that they see them, and we'll work to get answers for you. I did want to point out that the new TRI was released this week, and so you might want to go back on and look to see what the new TRI data might have that wasn't in the last one. And then how long, the next question is, how long would you expect the levels of ethylene oxide to decline after the closing of the Styrogenics plant, given that the half-life of ETO and any off-gassing from the warehouse and equipment?
We've gotten questions in the past about half-life, and it's on the order of a few months, something like 100 days approximately. So it is a significant amount of time. But as I said earlier, we started collecting post-seal order sampling on Tuesday, February 19th, continuing to the 20th and days following. So to the extent that there are still measurable levels post-seal order, we will be seeing that in our data.
Can you determine if the emissions are coming from the stack vent or the bay doors?
We can't tell that from the measurements that we have here. We'll continue to analyze the situation. When we do the modeling, we have releases from those points separately in the model. So the model may be able to track that, but the monitoring data that we've collected here does not allow us to get to that type of detail.
Okay, will you install air monitoring sites on higher elevations, such as the top of the water tower?
This is Lou Weinstock. One of the things we do in ambient sampling is we attempt to characterize emissions at breathing height. So, from a scientific perspective, there are studies sometimes that do vertical gradients. In a study here where we're supporting the risk assessment, a typical measurement height, as you've seen, if you've noticed the canisters, is something a little under, 2 meters, typical breathing height. So that's really the vertical height that our technical assistance document and our CRAP calls for, and it's really most representative of what people in the community are being exposed to.
So will EPA extend the monitoring into March and April now that the source is shut down?
Yeah, as I said earlier, the seal order has caused us to extend the monitoring. We really want to look at the information, the monitoring data post-seal order, and we'll make decisions about future monitoring after we receive and analyze that data. As I mentioned earlier, we should have that information ready to discuss with all of you in a couple of weeks.
Okay, so I understand that we have a limited data set, but I noticed that the concentrations of late are significantly higher than the concentrations in the summer and late fall. Do you have an opinion on whether the ambient temperatures may have an impact on those concentrations?
This is Lou Weinstock. We haven't necessarily explored a relationship between temperature and ethylene oxide itself. I mean, we've been mainly measuring in really late fall and winter. So in terms of temperature variation that I've seen in the MET data, it really hasn't been that great. Again, the correlations with the wind roses seem quite clear that seems to be the deciding factor. Where the wind blows is where the ethylene oxide goes. And I think it's, at this point, that's the thing that we're looking at the most that explains the sample day to sample day variation that Mike explained earlier today.
Hold on, folks. We're trying to get as many questions as we can here, and so we're trying to see if there's any groupings that we can come up with. So are there methods developed by the contractor for California EPA that allowed measurements down to the part per PPT part per trillion level? Are these being investigated for use by EPA?
This is Lou Weinstock. Along with the sampling program that we're doing, as well as the village and Sterigenics themselves using the TO15 canister method, we are absolutely exploring new technologies, both more sensitive technologies and also those that can give us a time resolution. We all acknowledge the limitations of 24-hour average concentrations, particularly when the wind varies. We've acknowledged that. So we have folks working with our Office of Research and Development to come up with methods that are both most sensitive and actually can give us either hour-by-hour observations or perhaps even more time resolved than that. Those new processes and methods are probably 6 to 12 months away, but we're actively working on them, and once they're available, we'll certainly test them at appropriate sites and compare them with the existing methods that we have now.
Okay. All right, so when will EPA be able to tell the residents what it means to have air monitoring levels so high?
So our plan has been to conduct a more refined risk assessment to make that available in the spring time frame. And as many of you are aware, there are ongoing conversations about the timing of a public meeting for us to present that information. So at that time, we will share the results of all of the analytical work that we've been doing and have a conversation about next steps.
Okay. And what will the proposed changes to the national emission standards for hazardous air pollutants, hydrochloric acid production, residual risk and technology review mean for the IRIS risk assessment for ETO?
So to be clear, the HCL rule does not include ethylene oxide as a regulated pollutant. The risk assessment that was done as part of that risk and technology review did examine ethylene oxide in order to look at total facility risk, but the rulemaking action does not directly address ethylene oxide emissions from sources in this category.
So we've got another grouping of questions is the height of the monitors and where the monitors were located. Could you speak to why the level was chosen that it was, and will there be other studies at different heights to be able to characterize where the plume or where the exposure might be?
Yeah, Laura, this is Lou Weinstock, and as I mentioned earlier, breathing height itself is just a very typical method strategy in all kinds of ambient monitoring, not necessarily for air toxics itself. For the schools in particular anyway, that's obviously part of the concern. We're monitoring at 3 different schools, each of which is a half to a mile or more away from the facilities themselves. There's really no reason to believe that the variation of ethylene oxide at those sites is going to be any different between 1.5 meters and 2 meters. So I think we understand the question, but the consistency of all measuring at the same height, is something that's important to us, and that's the strategy going forward, as explained in our quality assurance project plan.
Okay. So we got a couple questions about the different monitoring that's going on. What is there a time frame that we'll be comparing EPA's data with Willowbrook's air data? And then the second one is a question about the data that Sterigenics is taking it, and is EPA going to be considering that data as well?
So in terms of a time frame for us to have results or a determination about data comparability, we don't have a specific date by when we expect that to be completed. As I mentioned earlier, those are ongoing conversations between the technical folks such as Lou and the other groups collecting data, and that's an ongoing effort. We've only been able to look at a day or two in common so far, so we really need to look at additional days and need to have further conversations between the technical folks. In terms of whether we're going to be considering data provided by the company and as well as by the village, I think any and all information that is relevant, we will certainly want to take a look at. Exactly how we use it and how much weight we give it is still to be determined.
Okay, when will the new test be revealed? Is already March.
Yeah, and this is Lou Weinstock. You know, as Mike mentioned earlier, the results that we've presented here are within 4 days of the facility shutdown. The next data batch that we accept, which will be in a couple of weeks, will include sampling just before, but also, very importantly, on a number of days following the shutdown on February 15th. We expect that from the lab in the next week or so, and as we've explained in our QA plan, it does take us a couple of weeks to go through the detailed QA to give us the confidence to present that. So, you know, I'll say roughly in the 2 to 3 week span from now, we should have another data set, quality assured, which will tell us a lot of information about what happened after the seal order was put in place.
So why are operating permits given for hazardous emissions when the agency has no experience measuring them?
So we've been talking about air measurements, ambient measurements. The emission standards that we set at the national level are incorporated into state operating permits as appropriate for given source categories. And those emission standards do include certain requirements for emissions monitoring, different from ambient monitoring. So there are specific procedures that are used from an emission standpoint to determine compliance with those emission standards that we set in our national rules.
So, okay, will you be using both Sterigenics testing results and Willowbrook's testing result when you update the risk modeling?
As I said before, any and all information that's relevant to our risk assessment, we will certainly consider. How we use it and how much weight we give it is to be determined, but the side-by-side measurements that started in early February, we will continue to talk with the other parties about data comparability, and we'll just need to determine how we actually use that going forward in our work.
So we have a couple of, again, categories of questions. We've got a lot of questions about actions that the state of Illinois may be taking or information that they have posted on their website. We will be capturing those questions and sharing them with the state to make sure that they're aware of your questions and your concerns. There was also a number of not questions but comments, and I just want to assure folks that we're capturing those as well and making sure the management sees all of the, not just all the questions. We will try to be answering the questions that don't get answered today, but they also see the comments that you guys are providing through for these as well. Okay, next question. Why aren't the ambient concentration standards?
So ethylene oxide, as I mentioned before, is classified as a hazardous air pollutant, and under the Clean Air Act, we have pretty clear instructions for Congress in terms of how we regulate these hazardous air pollutants. And what we do is to set limits on the amount of pollution that industrial facilities can emit. We do not set outdoor ambient standards.
Yes.
So that is our statutory authority that we are using to address hazardous air pollutants like ethylene oxide.
So, we have, Holly and I have been promising a couple of webinars that I hope will help clarify the difference between the National Ambient Air Quality Standards and how we regulate air toxics. So that will hopefully help you guys understand the difference between the two programs and how even though we're, even though we're measuring the ambient concentrations right now, how the regulations kind of move forward with that without necessarily having that ambient standard. So we're hoping to have that webinar next week. We're getting the materials cleared right now, so hopefully we'll have that available. We also want to do a couple other webinars based on comments from folks in your area. We want to do one on public, effective public engagement. So when we get to the next steps, that you have the tools that you need to participate effectively. And then we've also been asked to do a webinar on how we will conduct a risk assessment. So those are all in the queue. We're getting the materials together for that. And as soon as we have them cleared, we will be moving forward. Okay, I think we have time for maybe another question or two. Why have there been no indoor air monitoring considerations? Independent testing has shown higher levels than outside.
Our authority under the Clean Air Act is to regulate outdoor air pollution, not indoor air pollution. There are other federal statutes that deal with indoor worker exposure, and other agencies have authorities there, but our authority is limited to outdoor air exposure.
Okay, so we've got a number of questions asking about how long we're monitoring. I know we've gone through that again, but let's reiterate that. How long are we going to be monitoring?
So right now our plan is to review the information that was collected at the end of February, the last weeks in February, as well as the information we are starting to collect into March, and we'll be sharing that with all of you in a couple of weeks in our next data posting on our next webinar. And it's that information that we think is very important to look at in order to make decisions about future monitoring.
Okay. At what point would EPA consider this long-term risk? Darcy, do you want to answer that? So I think that it's the important thing to remember is when we are looking at our residual risk analysis, that we're looking at a quote lifetime exposure. The way we conduct those, we look at lifetime in our risk assessment is typically 70 years. So it's a long time frame that we're looking at when we're looking at risk. And sorry, guys, we're still kind of compiling, looking at groupings here as much as possible so we can answer as many as we can.
Okay, so while they're looking for the last grouping, this is Holly Wilson again. I'll just remind you the data is posted at www.epa.gov/il/outdoor-air-data-Willowbrook-community. So for today's slides, you can go to that website and you'll be able to review the slides.
Okay.
It is 4:57, and we're going to have one more question before we sign off.
Right. Since all the monitoring sites exceed, quote, elevated risk levels for minimum, average, and maximum readings, why isn't that enough?
So our plan is to provide a complete, refined assessment of risk. Here we're looking at 13 weeks, 31 days of samples, and yes, there is a fair amount of variability as we see from one day to the next. All of that will be captured when we do the dispersion modeling, which will look at other meteorological conditions, a fuller set of meteorological conditions, and give us a more complete assessment of risk than what we're able to look at with just these few sampling days.
Yeah, so with that, we are out of time.
We'll take one more?
We want to do one more. Okay. Sorry, we're going to do one more maybe. Have you considered monitoring wind speeds at the individual test sites?
The meteorological data that we're getting from the warehouse, which we've acknowledged, very, very close in at the max concentration sites. There may be some variation, but overall, I mean, we're getting excellent wind speed, wind direction, temperature information that agrees at 3 different locations in the proximity of the facilities. So at this point, we feel like what we have at the Met Tower at the warehouse site is more than adequate to represent the meteorology over the entire network.
Okay, so with that, we're going to just remind you that we'll have another data posting in a couple weeks. I will be sending out information about the webinars we spoke of earlier. We are still looking for input on when you might want to have the webinars. I know we've had some folks concerned about stuff in the middle of the day. So if you want to send me a note to Laura McKelvey, mckelvey.laura@epa.gov on your preference of timings, I think that would be useful. With that, I wanted to thank everybody for your time today and all your questions, and we look forward to our next interaction. Thank you.
The leader has disconnected. The conference will be terminated in 5 minutes.